A new study tackles the possible bias that has played a role in police brutality and the use of deadly force. Recent cases of excessive force have sparked outrage and put a spotlight on the behavior and choices of police officers. Now, this study takes a closer look at the use of deadly force, and we're joined by Charles Menifield. He's the lead author of the study and the dean of the School of Public Affairs and Administration at Rutgers University-Newark. Good to see you. Glad to talk about this important topic. The cases that have got the most attention, sparked the most outrage, have been predominantly white officers killing unarmed black suspects. When you looked at the numbers, how often was that kind of stereotype what you saw, and how, in what cases wasn't it?
Exactly. The data actually shows that it doesn't occur as much as we would think that it would. You know, the majority of policemen in the U.S. are white, about 75%. So if we think about that, if all of the things are equal, we would think about 75% of the persons killed by police would be killed by a white police officer. However, when we look closely at the data, we find some very interesting things. So the key to this study addresses one question, and that is, are white police officers intentionally targeting young African American males? And we did not find evidence to support that claim. If you look at the media, it seems to support the notion that there's a lot of bad apples relative to police departments.
So you found white officers were committing these killings at a rate lower than you'd expect, but you did find that minorities were being killed at a rate higher than you would expect.
Exactly. Unfortunately, African American males more specifically were killed at a considerably higher rate than what we'd expect. More specifically, twice as much.
And last thing on the numbers before we get to kind of your larger takes on this, how often were suspects unarmed?
Depends on how you define armed.
Sure.
With a gun, 65% of suspects that were killed by police had a gun.
So 2/3 had a gun.
2/3 had a gun.
Okay, so you look at these numbers and you say this is not a case of a few bad apples. What do you see here?
What I see here is there's a few cases of white police officers being caught on camera doing some egregious acts. We could probably find some other people doing some other things. However, for us, we believe, based on the data as well as other research, that the problem is really with police departments and policymakers at the macro level, at the meso level. Police departments really have to look at the sorts of things that they're doing with respect to training, hiring practices, etc. Yesterday I was watching the news and they were talking about Ferguson. You know, it's been roughly 3 years since Michael Brown. And, you know, Ferguson was found guilty of essentially using the police department as a tool to get money out of minorities. And what we find is police chiefs, sheriffs, etc., set the tone for police departments. Things like stop and frisk, racial profiling, all of those things come from police departments. So what we want and what we believe is the solution is police departments have to say essentially, you know, what's the ramification of doing stop and frisk? What's the ramification of racial profiling? Is it going to affect any particular group? Whether it be black, women, you know, someone in the LGBT community, whatever. If that doesn't occur, it's not going to happen.
So look at those policies. What else prescriptive would you suggest police departments do or consider?
Well, the hiring practices. So one of the things that I haven't shared with you that we found in this study is a lot of African American males are killed by African American policemen, Hispanic policemen, Asian policemen. And the reason that occurs is because police chiefs and the leadership team have decided that African Americans should be policed by African Americans. So one would expect a large number of minorities to be killed by minorities because that's who are policing those neighborhoods. But that's part of the problem as well. I'm not suggesting that black people don't need to see black policemen, but they need to see all policemen. White, black, Hispanic policemen need to be socialized to work with all communities. That's how you build the trust that has eroded over time.
In virtually every case, these police officers, for one reason or another, are not prosecuted and virtually never convicted of these killings. Do you view that as a factor in how many killings there are?
Absolutely. So I gave you two scenarios earlier. So at the policy level, politicians have to essentially say, what are the ramifications of me passing a law that says we have a war on drugs, right? Everyone agrees that we want fewer drugs, but what does that law look like? If the law has a negative impact on a particular group, minorities, African American males, because the target is on low-level drugs, then suddenly you passed a law that has a negative impact on minorities. Police departments know that the law was passed, and they enforce it. What happens? There are more minorities that now have contact with police departments, and thus the likelihood of something bad happening goes up.
One thing you hear from some in law enforcement, and Bill Bratton, who ran the police force here in New York, in LA, in Boston, has made the point that police departments are forced to face and come in contact with problems that are not of their own making, that are larger societal failures around income inequality, around mental health treatment. To what extent do you think that's a legitimate defense for the problems police face?
It is a legitimate defense, but that goes back to training. You know, police chiefs should dig into their coffers and say, I need to train my officers to deal with a variety of different scenarios. So we know, and we see that police, they have an arduous job. I mean, being a policeman is a tough job. We are aware of that. But that doesn't excuse police chiefs and sheriffs from spending money to ensure that policemen are trained in everything that we can imagine. You know, implicit bias, microaggressive behavior, and how to communicate with citizens. Simple things like that really need to happen.
We saw this recent spat of violence again recently in Chicago. It seems to happen almost every summer weekend in that city, tragically. Do you think the types of changes you're suggesting would make a difference in the types of violence we see in places like Chicago?
I think so. I was watching.
And why? How?
Well, I listened to two sides of the coin last night. Two people were talking on the news about whether or not they thought the solutions would work. Doing nothing, obviously, is not a good plan. And one of the suggestions was we need to move the policemen. And that's where training comes into play. Moving a person is not the solution. Training is the key.
And help me understand what that training means. What aren't they doing that they need to do training-wise?
So some of the research that we looked at, we found that policemen, well, let's go backwards for a second. There's not a lot of people that want to be policemen. The pay is low, and obviously it's hazardous work. Over time, the requirements to become a policeman have diminished. In the past, it was at least a bachelor's degree. Some places it's an associate. Now it's a high school diploma. So as those levels of education diminish, then quite frankly, person's ability to respond to difficult situations could in fact be hampered by the lack of education. So my belief is train people in things that they may not be aware that they need. The other piece of it is we found a lot of research that showed people weren't psychologically prepared to be a policeman, but they were still hired. Tests like that have to be taken for what they're worth.
They get put in a situation they're not prepared for.
They're not prepared, but the examination upon hire suggested that you're not fit for service, but you were still hired.
Okay. Obviously a very important discussion. Happy to have it with you, Charles Menifield. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.